Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings, and I'm wearing this shirt just for you. I have my most current roundup set up for you guys today. 6 albums I've been listening to the last couple of weeks. Again, my intention here is just to throw some stuff out there and I've been listening to and see if maybe any of it catches your attention. It's all kind of superficial listens at this point. Some of it listen to quite a bit. But we got to get started. So the first one is Bubblegun by the Merrymakers. Now, I got a hold of this album because of 95% of the people who responded to me over on my post on Jellyfish and Andy Sturmer a little while back, a lot of people said that this is an album worth checking out if you're an Andy Sturmer fan, because Andy Sturmer makes an appearance on it. He does some of the co-writing on the album and also plays drums, but he's not actually in the group. He's not a member of the Merrymakers, so we make that clear. The Merrymakers are a Swedish duo. The album is classic late 90s power pop, which is both good and bad to a degree. Andy Sturmer's presence on the album kind of gives it some weight because he's one of the guys that was in Jellyfish, and Jellyfish kind of spawned a newfound interest in power pop in the 90s. It didn't always sound like Jellyfish, but definitely was inspired by that movement towards classic power pop music. And so at that point in the game, late 90s, a lot of it really started to sound the same. It kind of has flattened out its stylistic curve to a degree.
Seven seas with you, saltwater drinks are all on me. But hey, I won't forget my past, and even if I do, this morning's gonna last, and you will guide me through.
This is not the late 90s anymore, and my ear isn't so worn out on that. It's kind of refreshing to listen to. It definitely is not somebody trying to do that. It is somebody doing that style. So, Bubblegun by the Merrymakers is pretty good listen. Okay, next up is Seabuckthorn's Through a Vulnerable Occur. I've been listening to Seabuckthorn now for several years. His 2017 album, Turns, was my album of the year in 2018. And it's kind of spawned a whole new interest in ambient music that I hadn't really had in a while going up to that point. So I kind of kept up with him, and he had a really great release last year called The Crossing. And I noticed that the difference between Turns and The Crossing is that Turns really, his whole thing is to come at ambient music as a guitar player. So that first album had audibly sounded a lot like guitar playing. There's a lot of strumming and a lot of cross-picking. You can hear the strings and he's really milking like a lot of the natural resonance of the guitar on that album. When he did The Crossing is a little bit more affected. He's using different kinds of guitar techniques, so it's very open. It sounds less like your normal idea of a guitar, which is kind of the cool thing about it. Through a Vulnerable Occur began as part of a dialogue between Andy Cartwright, who is Seabuckthorn, and an Australian photographer. And their dialogue spawned this sort of book CD set. And I didn't get the book CD set, but the book is intended to be part of this experience, which I may actually go out and get the book later on. But for now, I'm just focusing on the musical aspects of this album. It's oddly compelling ambient music that you can hook onto things and listen to. The songs don't all sound the same. Each one has its own personality and characteristics, so it's not just like this background wash of sound. There is a sense of form and of melody in the music, but it's very like glacial pace that the music takes. And I think that this is another great album in that vein. My one thing about it is that between Turns and The Crossing, both of which are great albums, I don't know that this really does anything too terribly new. If you'd have never heard of Seabuckthorn before, this might be a good place to start because he kind of pulls from both of those styles and the other things that he's been kind of playing with off on the side. But if you're on the other albums, I'm still trying to think about how this might be the next step for him, or just a further exploration of what he's already done. Not that that's necessarily bad. He's very good at what he does, but I don't know if his innovation has kept up with his output. He's been pretty prolific. So I enjoy the album. Seabuckthorn's Through a Vulnerable Occur is great. I would suggest it for sure if you're specifically if you need sort of like the furniture music, something to listen to in the house that doesn't get in the way, but is still pretty engaging. Smooth, soothing, but not boring. Okay, the next album up is Flotation Toy Warning. And the album is called Bluffer's Guide to the Flight Deck. This is a 2003 album that I was completely oblivious of in 2003. I never heard it before until about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It showed up as a recommendation through Bandcamp. And so I listened to it and it really caught my attention. If I was going to point to something that's like kind of modern psychedelia, that feels like it, It's very colorful. The songs aren't terribly complex in form, like as far as the chords they use or how the songs are structured. But they get a whole lot of mileage out of different colors on the album. There's a lot of horns we'll be playing and orchestral stuff and chamber stuff and accordion, banjo, whatever you can think of is on the album. And it all fits together very nicely and has a sense of coherency. Man, it covers a lot of vivid ground along the way. First time I listened to it, I kind of thought like, well, it's kind of like, what if the Postal Service turned into a Pink Floyd cover band? Okay, not like they're really electronic like the Postal Service. Has kind of the same palette in a way, but a completely different stylistic version of that. I also have to kind of point out, I enjoyed the lead singer's voice quite a bit. He caught my attention as well. My first impression of him was like, well, it sounds kind of like David Bowie melodically, but his tone is nothing like that. He has a very kind of, unlike, David Bowie has a very rich baritone crooner style voice. He puts a lot of kind of breath and rasp into his voice, and I kind of think it's actually intended. It feels like his voice is straining, but it never shows actual signs of strain. Pitch doesn't change. The timbre feels very controlled. The singer really pulls the whole package together with that very unique tone he has in his music. Okay, next up is Log I Run, Vagrant Sleepers. This was an interesting suggestion that came to me through a listener who he called it his album of the year from 2019. I kind of bought the album sight unseen, and I would generally classify it as a kind of a prog metal album, but with a lot of caveats. Vag I Run has a lot more depth going on than it would seem. They're very stylistically diverse from one thing to the next, whereas, like, for example, the Flotation toy devices, they don't change styles that much. They change colors. Okay. In this case, the band changes around styles a lot, kind of like Igor, but not nearly as aggressive in their styles. And they'll push back all the way to almost Beatles pop style. Within the first minute of the album, you're hearing these very kind of Queen-esque, again, Jellyfish style background vocals, and that pervades throughout the album. And I've seen some live footage of them. I don't know that they really represent this super well in live. The studio is extremely clear, but I think the live stuff that they do as well is still compelling, and I think they show that they have caught those arrangements in the backgrounds that are present. And the arrangements are the name of the game for this album. The thing that makes it interesting is that as an album, it's a lot of fun to listen to because everything progresses very logically. Things don't seem to, ICs don't really run up against each other too much. They go from one thing to the next. But the problem is by the time you get to the end, you've heard so much. It's difficult to decide, this is my favorite song or that's my favorite song because so much has happened. And a lot of that can be mitigated by just repeated listening and getting used to it. So this is an album, for me, I usually can get a grip on an album in about 7 listens. And this one may take a couple more than that. There's just a lot going on with it. It's a really super enjoyable listen. And I'll tell you, the playing is killer. Okay, next up, a little bit of background. Between Hall & Oates, which is kind of how I got into my own musical journey was with Hall & Oates. And Rush, which changed everything for me in high school. There's this kind of middle school period that I ran through. A big player for me during that middle school time was definitely Tears for Fears. Songs from the Big Chair was a really kind of a standby album for me. So much so that a few years later in 1989, when Tears for Fears released Seeds of Love, I really had a hard time getting into it. And I have since, in the last 30 years since the album has come out, I've had so many people for decades tell me, this is a great album, you should check it out. And I've always kind of been resistant. When the single for this album, Sowing the Seeds of Love, came out, I missed the sort of subtle angst, darkness that was happening on Song of the Big Chair. It was very florid and happy and hippie style, and definitely in a Beatles style, kind of copying that psychedelic tone. And it felt weird to me. It didn't feel like the Tears for Fears that I had liked so much as a junior higher. And so I kept, every time it would show up, I would listen to it and go, yeah, it's pretty good. So finally I took the dive on it, and I got it this last month and a half ago or so. And I will say still, there's some parts in here that I have some resistance to, mainly because I feel like Tears for Fears really, really embraced soul and R&B in this album. But as I've been listening to it this last time, I kind of thought about Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel brought in a lot of African influences into his music in the 80s and was very good about recreating himself so it felt natural. Reframing it so that Tears for Fears incorporated that sound into what they had already had going on. Improved the way I listened to the album. And once I kind of get through the first 3 or 4 tracks where that feels the most pronounced, I feel like there's this really great beefy chunk, the last 2/3 of the album, that has a lot of really great songs in it that I just have never gotten to. So this is one that's been a real grow on me. I think that it will turn into a favorite. But I'm noticing the parts of me that resisted the album still, even after all this time. So that's me being stubborn. And finally, Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters. This has been her most recent release, quite visibly. She's gotten a lot of press out of this album, and most of it's really pretty justified. People are already calling it Album of the Year, and there is something about the album that feels very relevant right now. The theme of the album is about sort of, you're boxed in and you got to fetch the bolt cutters to get yourself out of whatever your predicament is. You feel boxed in by something. And of course, it's easy to reinterpret that feeling with the quarantine situation that we've been in. And it doesn't hurt anything that she pretty much recorded the whole album at her house between, 2015 and now. A lot of it has been done. You can hear the sounds of her house, the dogs barking. Many of the sounds in the album come from just things around her house, maybe a trash can or silverware. So her house plays a large role in the creation of the album. And there's a very interesting percussive approach that's going on with it, whereas found objects kind of are used to give it this sort of industrial feel. And that's super duper intentional. She really wanted percussion, I think, to be a push to the forefront of this album. And she still has some pretty amazing piano work on there. I still feel like when I listen to her piano playing, especially now, it feels like sort of angry Vince Guaraldi. Feels funny to say that, but it's actually a compliment, because that style of playing is very active and very attention grabbing, and she uses it really effectively throughout the album.
I used to march down the windy sidewalk, slapping my leg with the riding crop, thinking it made me come off so tough. I didn't smile because a smile always seemed rehearsed. I wasn't afraid of the bullies, and that just made the bullies worse. In class I'd pass the time, drawing a slash for every time the second hand went by. A group of 5 done 12 times was a minute, but Shamika said I had potential. Shamika said I had potential. Shamika said I had potential. Shamika said I had potential.
The album is kind of a little bit challenging in some ways. It has this sort of sense that she's doing this Tom Waits thing with the percussion and keeping yourself unpredictable, and kind of in a similar way. There's sections in here where I feel like the text is really driving the song. It kind of suppresses the melodies to a degree. When she does use the melodies on the album, they're awesome. It just feels like something is kind of like ranty about it sometimes. But here's an interesting side note about that. As I've been researching this album, she kind of had acknowledged that a little bit because she was struggling a little bit with learning how to use GarageBand. She was having some trouble with the program, and that caused her to sometimes ad-lib vocals that weren't really necessarily polished yet. And that, if that's the case, then that really explains a lot about it and actually makes the album feel more authentic and a little more down to earth. There's a lot of really ingenious things happening on the album. It's very, very creative. And I think one that's got some layers to it that I need to dig into a little bit. Okay, so that's my 6 right there. So if you have any of these songs or any of these albums you have opinions about, I surely would like to hear about them. I'm going to kind of keep them on rotation for another week or so. I have another few that I'm sort of starting to trickle in on. So make sure you know when the next post is going to be. Go ahead and like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Over on Spotify, I'll be putting tracks up from this on the master playlist, so you can go check that out. And next week, I'll bring you another post on whatever I'm listening to. So until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.